Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler review for Woven in Moonlight. This is a book that appeared on the somewhat controversial Times 100 Best Fantasy Books of All Time, and it's one that I had on my radar and had wanted to pick up even before I saw it on that list, but since having had it on that list, I was even more intrigued to see my thoughts on it, especially because I have not heard all that many people talk about it. The setup for the book is we follow our main character, Zemina. She is the only point of view in the story, so if you're a little bit tired of all the multi-point of view books, this one just follows her, and she has been a decoy from a very young age because of her resemblance to the royal figure who's supposed to take over the throne, essentially. And so from a very young age, she has not really had the luxury of living her own life. She hasn't really been able to ever be open and honest with other people. She's always having to fill a role. Her people, though, there is a revolution and they are sort of kicked out of power and they have been trying to survive out on their own, and things are becoming quite dire. And so the enemy takes it upon himself to say that he would like to marry the heir to the throne in order to kind of bridge the gap between their peoples. Obviously, given the fact that Zemina has been a decoy this whole time, she goes in the Condessa's place and she's kind of trying to scout out and spy on their behalf up until the wedding day. So if you like political intrigue, I wouldn't say it's too much of the day-to-day, how to rule and those sorts of things, but I think it's more about the intricacies that you find with revolutions. Zemina only knows her own experiences. She knows there was a revolution and the revolution affected her negatively, and she also has a big heart for her people and her Condessa. They are really good friends, and so she sees her side of things. And then as she is spending time with the rest of these people who that she's supposed to kind of end up tying herself to, she starts to see that maybe it wasn't as black and white as she thought. Maybe the revolution had some more justifications than she would have originally ever thought. Maybe there's more credit to be given to them. Anytime a book has that theme and explores that, I always find myself very intrigued and pulled in. It especially, I think, necessitates character growth as well, because when the character starts to reflect on how something so violent and catastrophic, essentially, to her own life and her own people, when they can sit back and start to see the other side, that's a really hard thing to do, even in real life. And so when fictional characters are starting to see that, you have to do a good job of establishing from the beginning their point of view so that as you're following them, you kind of start to see the shift not only in them, but you can believe it. And I think the author did a good job of establishing that. You feel for her people. They're starving. They're starting to run out of food. And so they're not really doing the greatest job of rationing. They're afraid that their own are going to kind of get violent. They don't know what's going to happen. They're afraid they're going to go into the city and steal from the people who conquered them, which might cause even more problems. So there's all these little things that are woven, pun intended, into the plot. But we also have another character who is not a main point of view. Like I said, you only have the one. But we have another character that shows up who is this vigilante masked figure. And I loved that element of the story. Nobody really knows who they're serving, if they're serving Zemina's people or the enemy's people, because they kind of seem to do their own thing. Nobody even knows if they are of one particular people or not. And for a while, our main character is like, the person, I don't take them seriously. But it was fun to kind of gradually get to find out more about this vigilante figure. And in general, this book, it is Latin American inspired, and it's specifically Bolivian history and politics inspired, and I thought the author did such a great job with that. There were so many little things, from the language to the food to the colors of the artwork or the colors that they prefer to use and the way that they dress. There's just so many little details that sometimes I think that we get so used to a certain kind of fantasy that just having something with a different inspiration, it can really highlight how much you get used to something else. And so for that alone, I think it makes the book stand out. And if you like descriptions of food, this book, I know some people absolutely love descriptions of food in their books. This book has so much of it. I constantly was like, I just felt like I eat the most bland food ever when they were describing food because they described so much food. There is a romantic subplot in the book that I, for the most part, quite enjoyed. There's one part where a character I thought overreacted a little bit, and I was like, hey, calm the heck down. And then they did pretty quickly. It didn't take long. But it almost a little bit felt like tension for the sake of tension that I didn't really think needed to be there. And ultimately, I think if the person had just not freaked the heck out at this one part, it wouldn't really have changed much. They could have just not been obnoxious for a second. But it really was not like one miscommunication after the next or anything like that. I overall really enjoyed the romantic subplot. I do think that these stakes were quite high in this book, especially because the main character is starting to see both sides, so then they don't really know where their loyalty lies anymore, and they also are starting to develop relationships with people, friendships with people, and they don't really want to have those people suffer the way that her people have suffered, and then she learns that they already have suffered, so she doesn't want them to suffer more, but she also loves her Condessa, she loves her people, and so she's kind of caught in the middle. And our character makes some pretty intense decisions at times. I was constantly surprised in the first chunk of the book with how brutal the character could be. I think that because this is young adult fantasy, we tend to find young adult, it holds back a little bit. And this one, I would say it didn't hold back. It was by no means incredibly grotesque or incredibly violent or anything like that, but it was rather cutthroat, I would say. And so we didn't have these endlessly long, bloody descriptions or anything, but it was more of the idea of what was happening or the decisions that characters would make were rather harsh at times. These decisions did have consequences, which is another thing I always really like seeing in books. When characters can just do whatever the heck they want, and then it doesn't seem like it affects anybody or anything, that's always a little frustrating, and this one you see the consequences. People don't take lightly. If you're gonna do really harsh things over here, then we're going to answer that with something equally harsh, if not more so. And so I think that element was done really well also, and it created even higher stakes. So I mentioned a bit ago that the stakes are quite high, especially for the main character, but just in general, because you don't really know what she's gonna do, and you don't know what the happy conclusion possibly could be. There's probably somebody who's going to get lost along the way. I do personally feel like this book could have gotten even heavier, and I think things could have gone down a slightly darker path. It not being incredibly intense and dark at the end, though, is okay. I mean, it is young adult, and I typically don't... It's not that young adult books never have stakes, because they do, and things do go down in this book, especially towards the end. There are some things that go wrong, and there's some misunderstandings. There's some intense reactions out of people. So things go down, but ultimately, I wouldn't say I was left, like, incredibly devastated or anything like that. It did stay, I would say, a little bit on the nicer side. So I think a lot of people, that's one thing that frustrates them, is that they want things basically to be the least amount happy possible in the end. This one does have some happiness to it at the end, maybe slightly conveniently or maybe slightly unrealistically given how complex the issues are. But I don't think it was to the detriment and it just totally ruined the book. I still think that the book was really solid. I also want to add really quick the magic, because when we read fantasy, a lot of times we want to know what's up with the magic. The magic in this is really interesting, very cool, but it's way more folklore inspired, I would say, than a magic system. So it's not like there's rules and limitations that we're accustomed to with things like Foundry Side, Black Prism, any of Sanderson's works. It's more of some people have these gifts, and the gifts often have to do with the moon, and I thought they were really creative. And I really liked, there's kind of an animal companion element to the book. It's very subtle, but I really liked that little detail. I thought it was really fun. But if you're looking for people with full-on powers that play a role in action and things like that, you're probably not really going to get that. You're also not really going to get a ton of action in this book. It's much more about the character kind of scheming and politicking and just being a spy. So they just gotta try to sneak around a lot. So it's not even really scheming, it's just finding out information and deciding what to do with it. If you are wondering, there is what looks like a sequel to this. It's actually more of a companion book. It chronologically takes place after this one, and it kind of looks like it follows something that's left rather open-ended at the end of this one. So you have that option, but you can definitely read this as a standalone. The characters that the other one follows are not really the same characters. So if you're looking for a really introspective, on behalf of the character I'd say, introspective, Latin-inspired, vigilante spy story, this I think will, obviously that's what this is going to fit your taste really well. I definitely really enjoyed it. I thought it was incredibly solid. I think that the way the Latin inspiration is done in this book is beautiful. It definitely sets this book apart, and it being on the Times list, if that gets more people to read this book, that would make me really happy. I do think that sometimes people stick their noses up a little bit at anything shelved as YA, but young people gotta have books to read too, and I think that this one was really fantastic. I had a great time with it, so if you do pick it up, I hope you enjoy it. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.